The sound of Admiral Thornton Aldridge's body striking the polished marble floor echoed through conference room Delta 7 like a judge's gavel sealing a verdict that had been decades in the making. Commander Ashlyn Garrett stood perfectly still, her dress uniform immaculate. Despite what had just transpired, her breathing controlled and measured as if she'd done nothing more strenuous than review an intelligence briefing. Master Chief Barrett Sullivan burst through the mahogany door with his sidearm already drawn, his SEAL training overriding the shock of what his eyes were telling him. A 3-star admiral lay unconscious on the deck of the most secure briefing facility at Crimson Bay Naval Command Center. A female officer, half his size, stood beside him with an expression that suggested she was waiting for something rather than fleeing from something. And nobody, not Sullivan, not Petty Officer Williams, who followed 2 steps behind with his weapon raised, not even the surveillance equipment that had been carefully disabled 40 minutes earlier, had seen exactly how one of the Navy's most decorated flag officers had ended up sprawled across the floor like a dropped marionette. "Ma'am, step away from the Admiral and identify yourself," Sullivan commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 26 years protecting high-value personnel in environments ranging from Pentagon briefings to forward operating bases, where the enemy wore uniforms that looked exactly like his own. Ashlyn raised her hands, slowly, palms visible in the universal gesture of non-threatening intent that transcended military protocols and touched something older in human psychology. "Master Chief Sullivan, I'm Commander Ashlyn Garrett, Naval Intelligence. Admiral Aldridge is unconscious but stable. He'll regain consciousness within the next 3 to 4 minutes with no permanent neurological damage." The clinical precision of her assessment struck Sullivan as fundamentally wrong for someone who should have been experiencing shock or fear or any of the normal human responses to violence between uniformed personnel. She sounded like a doctor providing a medical evaluation rather than a potential suspect describing an assault on a flag officer. "Ma'am, did you render Admiral Aldridge unconscious?" Williams asked, though his tone suggested he was having difficulty reconciling the physics of what such an action would require with the woman standing before him. "Yes, Petty Officer, in self-defense. After Admiral Aldridge committed sexual battery and physical assault upon my person." The words dropped into the room like ordnance, transforming the atmosphere from tactical response to something far more complex and dangerous. "Everything that occurred in this room has been recorded." Ashlyn continued, her voice maintaining that same matter-of-fact quality that suggested she was reading from a prepared script rather than improvising responses to an unprecedented situation. "Complete audio documentation will be submitted as evidence in the criminal proceedings that will follow this incident." Sullivan felt the dynamics of the situation shifting in directions his training hadn't prepared him to navigate. Protecting flag officers from external threats was straightforward. Identify hostile actors, neutralize them through appropriate application of force, secure the protected asset. But scenarios where the flag officer himself was the apparent aggressor, where the potential victim had successfully defended herself, where evidence of criminal conduct might exist somewhere in the sealed room behind him. These circumstances required different protocols that fell well outside his areas of expertise. Before we continue this story, tell us where you're watching from today, and if tales of justice against the abuse of power resonate with you. Make sure you're subscribed because what unfolds next will show you exactly why. Respect earned through fear isn't respect at all. It's borrowed time. 18 hours earlier, Ashlyn Garrett had entered the same gymnasium where junior officers struggled through their mandatory physical fitness training with the quiet confidence of someone who treated pain as information rather than punishment. At 05:30 hours, the facility was nearly empty, just the way she preferred it. No witnesses to the scarring that marked her knuckles like a topographic map of violence. No questions about why. A desk-bound intelligence officer moved with the fluid precision of someone whose body remembered lessons that didn't appear in any training manual the Navy officially acknowledged. The heavy bag swayed gently under combinations that would have seemed excessive for someone whose primary weapons were supposed to be analytical thinking. Left jab to establish range and rhythm. Right cross targeting the solar plexus. Lead hook to the floating ribs where bone met cartilage in ways that made breathing an optional activity. Each strike landed with the meaty thud of proper technique, meeting 70 pounds of sand and canvas. Muscle memory from places that existed only in classified files, and the nightmares of the people who'd been there. Kosovo in 2008, when she'd been 27 years old and convinced that the rules of engagement meant something more than suggestions to be followed when convenient. The compound outside Pristina, where a Serbian warlord named Dragan Kovac had mistaken her diplomatic credentials for weakness, her gender for vulnerability, her isolation for opportunity. She'd learned different lessons in that basement than the ones the State Department had sent her to teach. Ashlyn finished her routine with a series of sprawls and recovery drills that would have been more appropriate for a mixed martial arts competitor than a naval officer whose warfare specialty was supposed to involve satellites and signals intelligence, rather than bleeding on concrete floors. She showered quickly, methodically, washing away the sweat while her mind reviewed the timeline for what was coming. Her quarters reflected the transient nature of someone who'd spent the last decade treating permanent address as a polite fiction. Standard issue furniture arranged with military precision. A single photograph on the desk showing her commissioning day at Annapolis, young and idealistic, and convinced that her honor and duty were more than words people used to justify the unjustifiable. No plants, no decorations, nothing that suggested she expected to stay long enough to make the space feel like home rather than a way station between missions that never quite ended. The secure tablet on her desk displayed a single message, bland bureaucratic language that could have meant anything to anyone, without the proper context to decode its actual meaning. Commander Garrett report to Conference Room Delta 7 Crimson Bay Naval Command Center, 0900 hours. Urgent consultation required regarding overseas intelligence protocols and operational security assessments. Bring all relevant classified materials and prepare for extended discussion. Admiral T. Aldrich. Ashlyn had been expecting this message for 6 weeks. Ever since Naval Criminal Investigative Service, Special Agent Duncan Prescott had briefed her on an operation that officially didn't exist and would never appear in her service record regardless of its outcome. An operation that required her to walk into a locked room with a sexual predator who believed his 3 stars made him untouchable, who'd perfected his hunting technique over 12 years and 23 victims, who'd learned that the system would protect the powerful and silence the vulnerable with the reliable efficiency of physics. She reached for her phone, a specialized device whose encryption protocols would have given the National Security Agency's analysts a professional appreciation for paranoia elevated to art form. She dialed from memory, waiting through the series of clicks and digital handshakes that confirmed she was speaking on a line that existed in no database and generated no records. Blackwell, the voice that answered, carried the gravelly authority of someone who'd been giving orders since before Ashlyn was born, back when the Cold War was something more than a historical period that happened to other people. Sir, it's Ashlyn. The meeting is confirmed. Delta 7, 0900 hours. Captain Desmond Blackwell, retired, had spent 36 years in naval intelligence, back when that meant stealing secrets from the Soviet Union rather than monitoring terrorist chatter on social media. He'd been the one to first notice the pattern around Aldrich, 15 years ago, back when the then captain had been serving in Iraq and female officers under his command had started requesting transfers with suspicious frequency. But noticing patterns and proving them were different skills, and Blackwell had never quite gathered the evidence that would survive the kind of legal scrutiny a flag officer could bring to bear. You don't have to do this, Commander. We can find another way, another target, someone without his connections. Ashlyn checked her reflection in the mirror above her desk, adjusting the ribbons on her dress uniform with mathematical precision. Every commendation positioned exactly according to regulations. Every crease sharp enough to cut paper. Everything perfect, because perfect was what operations like this required. Sir, with respect, we've been looking for another way for 15 years. How many more women get to sacrifice their careers while we search for the perfect prosecution that doesn't require anyone to take risks? Silence on the other end of the line, the kind of quiet that acknowledged uncomfortable truths without endorsing them. Aldridge is dirty, Ashlyn. Dirty in ways that go beyond what he does to female officers. I suspected it back in '03 during the Iraq deployments, but I could never prove it. The man's a predator, and predators don't stop hunting just because someone asks them nicely. That's why I'm not planning to ask nicely, sir. Blackwell's laugh sounded like gravel shifting in a landslide. Just remember what I taught you. Predators are predictable. They always take the bait. The trick is making sure you're the hunter and not the prey. I'll remember, sir. And Commander, when this is over, when you're sitting in front of lawyers and investigators, trying to pick apart every decision you made in that room, remember that some fights are worth having even when the cost is high. Especially when the cost is high. Ashlyn ended the call and returned her attention to the tablet, pulling up Admiral Thornton Aldridge's official biography. The sanitized version available to anyone with basic security clearance painted the portrait of a distinguished career built on steady advancement and careful navigation of political currents. 3 stars earned through a combination of competent staff work and an instinct for aligning himself with superiors whose own careers were ascending. Deployments to all the right conflicts at all the right times. Desert Storm as a junior officer. Iraq as a staff planner. Afghanistan in an advisory role that kept him close enough to the action to claim combat credentials without the inconvenient risk of actual combat. What the official biography carefully omitted was the pattern of female officers mysteriously requesting reassignments from his command, the complaints that somehow never quite reached formal channels. The way conversations died when he entered rooms full of uniformed women who'd learned that some warnings were passed through silence rather than words. Ashlyn had read the classified addendum to Aldridge's file, the one that required special authorization to access and existed in databases that would delete themselves if anyone without proper clearance tried to view them. 23 confirmed victims over 12 years. Harassment escalating to assault, threats made behind locked doors, where witnesses were inconvenient and surveillance systems were mysteriously disabled. A pattern as clear as a signature, and just as legally inadmissible without evidence that could survive the kind of legal assault a flag officer with connections could mount. That was going to change today. She opened the secure compartment in her desk drawer, removing a device that looked like an ordinary fitness tracker, but represented several $1 million of research by people whose job descriptions included phrases like signals intelligence and technical penetration, military-grade recording equipment, voice-activated, encrypted transmission protocols that would send every word spoken in Delta 7 directly to servers, monitored by personnel who specialized in protecting assets like her. The kind of equipment that required authorization from levels of command so high they couldn't be mentioned without classification caveats. Ashlyn slipped the device onto her wrist, watching the tiny LED confirm activation with a pulse of green light, so brief it might have been imagined. Every word from this point forward would be documented with the kind of precision that made lying impossible and truth unavoidable. She stood adjusting her uniform one final time and spoke quietly to the empty room. This is Commander Ashlyn Garrett. Time is 0647 hours. I am proceeding to Conference Room Delta 7 at Crimson Bay Naval Command Center for a meeting with Admiral Thornton Aldridge. This operation is authorized under JSOC Special Access Program Blackwater 7. All subsequent audio will be recorded and transmitted in real time to designated monitoring stations. If I do not check in within 90 minutes of meeting commencement, response protocols should be activated immediately. The morning was cold in the way that only coastal Maine could achieve a damp chill that cut through uniforms and reminded everyone that the Atlantic Ocean was not their friend. Crimson Bay Naval Command Center rose from the rocky coastline like a monument to military paranoia elevated to architectural principle. 87 acres of reinforced concrete blast-proof windows, and enough surveillance equipment to track a mosquito's flight path from the Canadian border to Portland. The kind of facility where classified operations were planned behind triple encrypted doors, and careers were forged or shattered with the stroke of an administrative pen. Ashlyn walked through the security checkpoints with the bored efficiency of someone who'd made this trip enough times that novelty had been replaced by routine. Retinal scan, biometric hand geometry, two-factor authentication from her KYC card, and a randomly generated code on her secure phone. Every step logged in databases that would preserve this information long after everyone involved had retired or died, ensuring that future investigators would be able to reconstruct her movements with timeline precision. The elevator to the 7th floor required 2 different security cards and another biometric scan. She rode up alone, watching the floor numbers illuminate in sequence while her mind reviewed the tactical situation. Delta 7 was designed for compartmented briefings requiring absolute privacy, soundproofing that could defeat directional microphones, electromagnetic shielding that made electronic surveillance from external sources impossible. The kind of room where conversations about national security took precedence over every other consideration, including, apparently, the safety of the officers who held those conversations. Admiral Aldrich had chosen this location with deliberate care, though perhaps not with complete understanding of how that care would be interpreted by investigators analyzing his decisions after the fact. The 7th floor corridor was empty at 0847 hours. Ashlyn noted the absence of foot traffic with the same professional attention she'd given into disabled surveillance cameras and locked doors during previous operations in places that officially didn't exist. Privacy in a facility like Crimson Bay required advanced planning and an administrative authority that reached beyond standard command structure. Aldrich had wanted to ensure their meeting would be uninterrupted, undocumented, unwitnessed. He'd succeeded beyond his intentions. She paused outside Delta 7, taking 3 deep breaths while reviewing the parameters one final time. The recording device would capture everything. JSOC monitors would be tracking the audio in real time if the situation deteriorated beyond her ability to manage. Federal agents were positioned to breach the door within 90 seconds of a distress signal that she could trigger with a specific phrase spoken into the device. But the entire operation depended on Aldrich taking the bait, escalating according to his established pattern, providing the kind of evidence that couldn't be explained away by expensive lawyers or political connections. That meant she needed to walk into this room knowing she might have to experience assault before she could respond to it. Knowing that justice sometimes required bleeding before you earned the right to make the guilty party understand what bleeding felt like. Ashlyn knocked twice sharp and professional, then entered when Aldrich's voice called permission through the thick door. Conference room Delta 7 lived up to its reputation for expensive paranoia. Mahogany paneling that absorbed sound the way black holes absorbed light. Recessed lighting designed to eliminate shadows that might hide listening devices. A conference table that could seat 12 but currently held only 1 occupant, whose 3 stars gleamed under carefully positioned spotlights that made him look like exactly what he was supposed to be, a distinguished senior officer whose career represented the Navy's highest ideals. Commander Garrett, thank you for being punctual. Please have a seat. Admiral Thornton Aldrich gestured toward the chair positioned across from him, a calculated placement that put his back to the wall and forced her to sit where he could study her from a position of territorial dominance. He was 64 years old, but maintained the kind of physical presence that suggested either good genetics or expensive personal trainers. Silver hair cut to regulation length, square jaw that photographers loved for recruitment campaigns, eyes that moved across her uniform in ways that had nothing to do with checking ribbon placement and everything to do with the predatory assessment of someone selecting prey. Ashlyn sat crossing her ankles in the way Female officers learned to adopt when men in positions of authority felt entitled to evaluate their legs along with their service records. Admiral, your message mentioned urgent consultation on overseas intelligence protocols. How can I assist you, sir? Aldrich smiled, the kind of expression that never quite reached his eyes, and began the performance he'd perfected over 12 years and 23 victims. Professional questions about her deployment history, tactical assessments of her intelligence reports from Afghanistan, thoughtful inquiries about her recommendations for improving information sharing between operational units and strategic planning cells. All perfectly appropriate, all completely irrelevant to what was actually happening. Ashlyn answered his questions with the kind of precise, factual responses that her training had taught her were essential in situations where clarity could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She explained her assessment, that is proposed modifications to intelligence gathering protocols in Kandahar province were tactically unsound and strategically naive. She detailed why his suggested changes to reporting chains would compromise operational security rather than enhance it. She used professional language to deliver the message that his analysis was charitably speaking the work of someone who'd spent too much time in air-conditioned offices and not enough time in places where bad planning got people killed. She watched his jaw tighten with each correction, each implicit challenge to his authority, each reminder that her decade of actual operational experience might be worth more than his collection of staff positions and political appointments. Commander, his voice had dropped an octave, losing the veneer of collegial discussion and revealing something harder underneath. Do you know what your problem is? Ashlyn touched her wrist casually, feeling the device pulse once to confirm it was recording, documenting everything for the analysts who would dissect this conversation with the attention to detail usually reserved for terrorist communications. Sir, I'm not aware that I have a problem. I'm providing my professional assessment of operational protocols, as you requested. Your problem. Aldrich continued, standing now and moving around the conference table with the deliberate steps of someone who'd choreographed this movement many times before, is that you seem to think your overseas experience makes you qualified to question a flag officer's judgment, that your tactical perspective somehow matters more than 3 decades of service and the strategic vision that comes with command authority. He was close now inside the social distance that regulations and common decency both required personnel to maintain unless operational necessity demanded otherwise. Close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the way his pupils had dilated in ways that had nothing to do with the lighting levels in the room. With respect, Admiral, I'm simply noting that your proposed modifications would likely result in increased risk to personnel on the ground without corresponding improvement in intelligence quality. Aldrich's hand found her shoulder fingers, pressing down with weight that was neither accidental nor justified by any professional context. The touch lasted exactly 4 seconds, long enough for the recording device to capture the moment, long enough for Ashlyn to register the possessiveness behind it, long enough for her nervous system to flash warning signals that predator recognition software, written by evolution, had been screaming for the last 10 minutes. Commander Garrett, let me explain something about how things work at this level. Your career advancement, your assignment, opportunities, your entire future in this organization, all of that depends on officers like me writing favorable fitness reports and recommending you for positions that actually matter. Do you understand what I'm telling you? The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Comply or face professional destruction. Submit or watch your career burn. Let me do what I want, and maybe if you're convincing enough in your gratitude, I'll throw you the occasional crumb of advancement. Ashlyn stood slowly and deliberately, forcing Aldrich to step back slightly while she established patterns that he deliberately violated. Her voice remained level professional, the tone of someone who was documenting facts rather than making accusations. Admiral, I need you to maintain appropriate distance and professional conduct. This conversation has moved outside the bounds of appropriate interaction between senior and subordinate officers. The slap came before she finished speaking, his open palm striking her left cheek with enough force to snap her head sideways. The sound echoed off the mahogany walls like a gunshot, sharp and sudden, and designed to shock rather than seriously injure. Ashlyn felt the sting spread across her face, felt her training analyzing the biomechanics of the strike, felt something colder than anger settling into her nervous system, like ice crystallizing in winter water. She smiled, not the submission Aldridge had expected, not fear or desperate negotiation, or any of the responses his previous victims had provided when he used this exact technique in this exact room to establish his dominance. Something else entirely. Something that made his predatory instincts suddenly uncertain about who was hunting whom. That's going to look terrible on the recording, Admiral. The confusion on Aldridge's face would have been comical if the situation hadn't been so deadly serious. His eyes darted around the room, looking for cameras he knew were disabled, looking for witnesses he'd carefully ensured wouldn't exist, looking for any explanation for why his perfectly planned assault was suddenly collapsing into something he didn't control. What recording? There's no. Ashlyn touched the device on her wrist, watching his eyes track the movement and finally understand what he was seeing. Voice-activated, military-grade recording equipment, Admiral. Encrypted transmission protocols, real-time data upload to secure servers monitored by personnel with JSOC authorization to intercept and document criminal activity by senior military officers. Every word you've spoken, every threat you've made, every time you touched me without permission, all of it recorded with timestamp precision that will make denial impossible and prosecution straightforward. The color drained from Aldridge's face as he processed the implications of what she was describing. His careful isolation hadn't protected him. His disabled surveillance systems hadn't ensured privacy. His 3 stars hadn't made him untouchable. He'd walked into a trap that looked exactly like his own hunting ground because the bait had been designed by people who understood predators better than he understood himself. That's illegal, he managed, finally grasping for any procedural objection that might invalidate what was happening. Recording without consent violates. JSOC authorization includes exemption from standard consent requirements when documenting criminal activity by senior military personnel. The recording is not only admissible, Admiral, it's legally protected in evidence that can't be suppressed regardless of procedural challenges your attorneys might want to mount. Ashlyn watched him cycle through the stages of recognition that this situation was beyond his control, watched him realize that his career was effectively over the moment he decided to strike her, watched the predator understand that the trap had closed and the hunter was standing inside it with him. But recognition didn't lead to surrender. It led to desperation. You set me up. This whole thing was planned. You came here knowing exactly what you were going to do. I came here knowing exactly what you would do, Admiral, because men like you are remarkably predictable. Your behavioral patterns have been studied and documented by people whose job it is to understand how institutional predators operate. Every action you've taken tonight follows a script we've seen hundreds of times before. Aldridge's hands clenched into fists, his breathing coming faster as panic overrode whatever remained of his tactical thinking. He was cornered, exposed, facing consequences he'd avoided for 12 years through careful selection of victims and thorough exploitation of systemic protections. And like every predator who'd ever been backed into a corner, he chose to fight rather than submit. Nobody will believe that recording represents the full context. A few minutes of audio can be edited, manipulated, taken out of context. My 32 years of unblemished service against the word of a junior officer with questionable judgment who clearly engineered this entire situation. Questionable judgment. Ashlyn's voice carried an edge now, not a fear, but something colder and infinitely more dangerous. Admiral, questionable judgment is what you demonstrated when you decided to assault someone without bothering to investigate who you were really dealing with. Let me tell you about questionable judgment. She began walking slowly around the conference table, forcing him to track her movement, establishing the psychological dynamic that she was the one who controlled space and timing now. In 2008, I was in Kosovo, on a counterinsurgency operation that officially never happened. There was a Serbian warlord named Dragan Kovac who had similar problems with authority. Thought his militia connections made him untouchable. Thought his network of corrupt officials meant he could do whatever he wanted to whoever caught his attention. Aldrich tried to interrupt, but Ashlyn continued, as if he hadn't spoken, her voice taking on the clinical quality of someone recounting historical events rather than making threats. Kovac had a habit of cornering female personnel who worked for international organizations, UN staffers, NGO coordinators, anyone who was isolated and vulnerable and unlikely to have institutional protection. He was particularly fond of using locked rooms where witnesses were inconvenient. "I don't care about some Serbian criminal," Aldrich snapped, but the tremor in his voice suggested he cared very much about where this story was heading. "You should care, Admiral, because Kovac was found unconscious in his compound with very specific trauma patterns. Carotid artery compression, precise strikes to nerve clusters that caused temporary paralysis. The kind of damage that comes from professional combat training applied with surgical precision. And after he woke up, after he spent 3 weeks in a military hospital, being evaluated by doctors who couldn't quite explain how someone with his training had been taken down so efficiently, do you know what changed?" Aldrich's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. He never touched another woman inappropriately for the rest of his life. Never used his position to intimidate subordinates. Became remarkably careful about respecting boundaries and maintaining professional conduct. It was quite the transformation. The silence that followed stretched between them like a tripwire waiting for someone to stumble. "You're threatening to assault a flag officer." "I'm providing historical context about what happens when predators encounter someone qualified to provide corrective education, Admiral. What you choose to do with that information determines what happens next." Aldrich's breathing had shifted to the shallow, rapid pattern of someone experiencing genuine fear for the first time in a long time. His eyes darted toward the door, calculating distances and timing, trying to determine if he could reach it before she could stop him, trying to decide if running was less humiliating than whatever alternative she was implying. But pride and panic made a toxic combination in men who'd spent decades being told their authority was absolute and their judgment unquestionable. "Last chance, Commander. Delete that recording. Forget everything that happened here. We both walk away and pretend this meeting never occurred." Ashlyn stopped moving, standing perfectly still across the conference table from him. And when she spoke, her voice carried the absolute conviction of someone who'd already calculated every possible outcome and chosen which one she wanted. "Admiral, the only person walking away from this room under their own power is the one who's smart enough not to make this situation worse than it already is. And unfortunately for you, that appears to be me." Thornton Aldrich clenched his fist and threw the punch that would end his career, his freedom, and his carefully constructed fiction that stars equaled immunity from consequences. The biomechanics of violence are mathematical. Force equals mass times acceleration. Momentum requires both weight and velocity. Leverage multiplies strength through geometric advantage. Everything Aldrich put into that punch, his 64 years, his rage, his desperation, meant nothing compared to the cold physics of someone who'd been trained to kill efficiently and had practiced those skills in places where hesitation meant dying. Ashlyn's left hand intercepted his wrist, mid-swing, fingers locking around bone and tendon with pressure that compressed nerve clusters responsible for motor control. Not a desperate block, not a lucky deflection. Calculated interception that demonstrated she'd been tracking his movement from the moment his shoulders telegraphed his intention to strike. Her right hand drove upward in a palm strike that connected with his chin at precisely the angle required to transfer maximum kinetic energy to his brainstem without causing permanent neurological damage. The impact sent shock waves through his nervous system that disrupted electrical signals between brain and body, creating momentary paralysis that left him conscious but unable to coordinate movement. His legs buckled, the room tilted, Admiral Thornton Aldrich discovered what it felt like to have 3 decades of authority made irrelevant by someone who understood that violence was a technical skill rather than a matter of rank. Ashlyn maintained control of his captured arm while he fell, using his own weight to guide his descent in directions that prevented him from striking furniture or injuring himself beyond the damage she'd already calculated as necessary. Her movements flowed with practiced efficiency, the muscle memory of someone who'd performed similar techniques countless times under conditions far more challenging than Pentagon briefing rooms. He hit the marble floor with the dull thud of dead weight, his body betraying him completely as the precisely applied force achieved exactly the neurological disruption she'd intended. His vision blurred. His inner ear reported information that contradicted what his eyes were seeing. His hands tried to reach for her, but his fingers wouldn't respond to commands that were getting lost somewhere between intention and execution. Ashlyn followed him down her knee, finding the pressure point behind his left ear with mathematical precision. She applied exactly enough pressure to compress the carotid artery without causing permanent damage, the technique called a blood choke in combat training, though. Her education had included the clinical terminology and physiological mechanisms that made it effective. Properly applied pressure to the carotid artery reduced blood flow to the brain by approximately 70%. Unconsciousness followed within 3 to 7 seconds, depending on the target's physical condition and stress response. Aldrich struggled briefly, his hands clawing at her leg with diminishing coordination as oxygen deprivation took effect. She maintained pressure for exactly 4 seconds after he stopped moving, ensuring complete unconsciousness while avoiding the brain damage that could result from prolonged compression. When she finally released the hold, his breathing was steady and natural, his pulse strong but slow, his body positioned in recovery posture that would prevent aspiration if he vomited during the transition back to consciousness. The entire sequence had required less than 10 seconds, from the moment Aldrich began his punch to the moment his unconscious body settled against the mahogany flooring. Ashlyn stood slowly adjusting her uniform with automatic precision while conducting rapid assessment of his condition and the tactical situation that would develop when Sullivan and Williams heard the impact. His breathing was regular. His color was good. His pulse suggested he would wake naturally within 5 to 10 minutes with nothing more serious than a headache and severely damaged ego. She moved to the door, calculating angles and distances, while listening for sounds that would indicate immediate response from exterior security. The room's soundproofing would have muffled the most noise, but the specific impact of a 200-pound body striking marble flooring might have been audible to trained personnel whose jobs required attention to subtle audio cues. Her breathing remained controlled. Her heart rate was elevated but manageable. Her mental state focused on tactical considerations that would determine whether this situation concluded with Aldrich in custody or her in a morgue. Behind her, Admiral Aldrich stirred slightly unconsciousness, beginning its natural retreat. She had perhaps 3 minutes before he regained full awareness. 3 minutes to prepare for conversations that would determine whether justice or institutional protection would govern what happened next. The door handle turned with deliberate precision. Master Chief Barrett Sullivan entered first, his hand resting on his holstered sidearm, but not yet drawn, his eyes sweeping the room in the methodical pattern that identified exits, obstacles, and potential weapons before focusing on the unconscious Admiral. And that was when Commander Ashlyn Garrett spoke the words that would change everything. Master Chief Sullivan, Admiral Aldrich assaulted me. I defended myself using appropriate force. Everything that occurred in this room has been recorded and transmitted to JSOC for evidence preservation. I am requesting immediate NCIS response and medical evaluation for both parties. The future that followed those words would be complicated, painful, and absolutely necessary. But it would be just. Sullivan's hand remained steady on his sidearm as he processed what Commander Garrett had just said. Sexual assault, self-defense, recording equipment, JSOC authorization. Each word added another layer of complexity to a situation that had already moved far beyond standard security protocols. But nothing in those 26 years had prepared him for the cognitive dissonance of watching a female commander half his size standing calmly beside an unconscious 3-star admiral while explaining that she just defended herself against sexual assault using techniques that suggested training far beyond what the Navy officially provided to intelligence officers. "Ma'am, I need you to remain in position while we secure Admiral Aldrich and request medical assistance," Sullivan said, his voice steady despite the mental calculations running through his head at processor speeds. "Protect the Admiral. Secure the potential threat. Document the scene. Call for backup. Preserve evidence." All standard protocols of Batuba for situations that were supposed to be straightforward but rarely were. Petty Officer Williams moved to Aldrich's position, kneeling beside the unconscious officer to check vital signs with the clinical efficiency of combat medic training that every SEAL received during the pipeline. Pulse steady at 72 beats per minute. Breathing regular and unlabored. Pupils responsive but dilated. Skin color normal. All indicators of someone recovering from controlled unconsciousness rather than serious head trauma. Williams had seen similar presentations before, mostly in personnel who'd been subdued through non-lethal force by military police or security contractors trained in restraint techniques that prioritized control over injury. But he'd never encountered a situation where a flag officer was the recipient of such techniques, and the professional part of his brain was struggling to reconcile standard operating procedures with a scenario that had no standard and barely qualified as procedural. "Admiral's vitals are stable, Master Chief. No apparent trauma beyond what's consistent with controlled blood choke application. He should regain consciousness within the next few minutes." Sullivan nodded once, filing that assessment away while his attention remained fixed on Commander Garrett. She hadn't moved since his arrival, hadn't made any gesture that could be interpreted as threatening, hadn't shown any of the emotional distress he might have expected from someone who just engaged in physical violence with a superior officer. Her hands remained visible, palms open, posture relaxed but alert in the way that suggested she was waiting for something rather than recovering from something. "Commander, I'm going to need you to provide a preliminary statement about what occurred here." Ashlyn's voice maintained that same clinical precision that Sullivan was beginning to recognize as her default, setting the tone of someone who trained herself to deliver information under stress without the emotional coloring that made witness statements unreliable. At approximately 0903 hours, Admiral Aldrich initiated unwanted physical contact by placing his hand on my shoulder. At 0911 hours, he struck me across the face with his open palm. At 0917 hours, after I informed him that his conduct was being recorded and requested, he maintained professional boundaries. Admiral Aldrich attempted to strike me with a closed fist. I defended myself using non-lethal restraint techniques, rendering him unconscious through carotid artery compression. Total time from his initial attack to loss of consciousness was approximately 8 seconds. The specificity of her timeline, the clinical description of techniques, the complete absence of emotional language, all of it triggered Sullivan's instincts that something much larger than a simple assault was unfolding in this mahogany-paneled room. "Ma'am, you mentioned the recording equipment. Can you elaborate on that?" Ashlyn touched the device on her wrist with a gesture so casual it might have been Anna checking the time. Except Sullivan watched her eyes track to confirm that the tiny LED was still pulsing with that almost invisible green light that indicated active transmission. "This is military-grade recording equipment authorized under Joint Special Operations Command, Special Access Program, Blackwater 7. Voice-activated encrypted transmission protocols. Every word spoken in this room since I entered at 0847 hours has been captured and transmitted in real time to secure servers monitored by JSOC personnel. The audio documentation includes Admiral Aldrich's sexual harassment, his physical assault, his threat to kill me if I reported his conduct, and my defensive response." Sullivan felt the situation shifting again, moving from simple assault into territory that involved acronyms and clearance levels that put this far above his authority to manage. JSOC meant Joint Special Operations Command. Special Access Programs meant operations that existed in classification tiers most military personnel would never know about. Real-time monitoring meant that somewhere people with far more stars than Aldrich were listening to this conversation and making decisions about how it would end. Williams Contact-Based Security. Request immediate NCIS response medical evaluation team and JAG legal counsel. Tell them we have a flag officer incident requiring immediate investigation by personnel with appropriate security clearances. The Williams moved to the secure phone mounted on the wall, speaking in the clipped professional tones of someone reporting information that would trigger response protocols throughout the entire command structure. Within minutes, this room would be flooded with investigators, lawyers, medical personnel, and senior officers whose careers would be defined by how they handled what came next. Behind them, Admiral Aldrich groaned softly as consciousness began its reluctant return. His eyes opened to confusion and disorientation, the natural result of a brain that had been temporarily deprived of oxygen and was now struggling to reconstruct recent events from memory fragments that felt more like fever dreams than actual experience. Sullivan watched the recognition dawn in stages across Aldrich's face, the confusion of waking on a floor when his last clear memory was standing, the pain radiating from his jaw where Ashlyn's palm strike had connected, the presence of his own bodyguards standing over him, while a female officer he'd been absolutely certain he controlled waited with the patience of someone who'd already won. Aldrich tried to sit up his movements uncoordinated, as his nervous system remembered how motor control was supposed to work. Sullivan moved to assist him, professional courtesy overriding his personal assessment of what might have actually happened in this room. Admiral, stay down. Medical personnel are en route. You've been unconscious for approximately 4 minutes. What? Aldrich's voice came out rough, his throat still processing the effects of compression that had shut down blood flow without damaging tissue. What happened, Dean? Sir Commander Garrett states that you assaulted her and she defended herself. NCIS has been notified and will be conducting a full investigation. The words seemed to penetrate Aldrich's consciousness like incoming artillery, each syllable detonating against whatever fantasy he'd constructed about how this situation would resolve. His eyes found Ashlyn standing exactly where she'd been when Sullivan entered, and the rage that flooded his expression suggested that unconsciousness hadn't taught him anything about the fundamental change in their respective positions. That's not, you can't. I'm a 3-star admiral and she. Sir, I'm advising you to remain silent until legal counsel arrives. Anything you say from this point is being documented as evidence. Aldrich tried to lunge toward Ashlyn from his position on the floor, some primal part of his brain still convinced that violence would solve problems that had moved far beyond the reach of physical force. Sullivan caught him easily, decades of restraining combative personnel making the action almost automatic. Admiral Aldrich, you need to remain in position. Do not approach Commander Garrett. Do not make any statements without legal counsel present. The door opened again, this time admitting the medical team that Williams had requested. 2 Navy corpsmen with emergency response bags and the practiced efficiency of people who treated everything from cardiac arrests to gunshot wounds in environments ranging from sick bay to forward operating bases under fire. They moved to Aldrich's position, beginning their assessment with questions designed to evaluate cognitive function and neurological damage. Sir, can you tell me your name and current location? Admiral Thornton Aldrich, Crimson Bay, Naval Command Center, and I want that woman arrested immediately for assaulting a flag officer. The corpsman glanced at Sullivan with an expression that suggested this was already the most complicated medical call he'd handled this month, then returned his attention to checking Aldrich's pupils and palpating his jaw for signs of fracture. Admiral, we're going to transport you to the medical facility for full evaluation. You may have sustained a concussion or other head trauma that requires imaging. I don't need imaging. I need that woman in custody. Sullivan was saved from having to respond by the arrival of Special Agent Duncan Prescott, who entered conference room Delta 7 with the wary authority of someone who'd spent 20 years with Naval Criminal Investigative Service and thought he'd seen every variation of military misconduct until reality proved him wrong again. Prescott was 45 years old, with the kind of face that suggested he'd stopped being surprised by human behavior sometime during the Clinton administration. Gray at the temples, permanent squint lines from too many years reading reports under fluorescent lighting. A suit that was probably expensive when he bought it but had long since settled into the comfortable rumpled state of someone who prioritized function over appearance. He swept the room with eyes that catalogued everything from Sullivan's defensive posture to Williams's position near the door to Aldridge's disheveled uniform and the way Commander Garrett stood with her hands visible and her expression suggesting she'd been waiting for him specifically. Master Chief Sullivan, Petty Officer Williams, I'm Special Agent Prescott NCIS. I understand we have a situation involving Admiral Aldridge and Commander Garrett that requires immediate investigation. Sullivan felt relief flood through him at the transfer of responsibility to someone whose job actually involved sorting out complicated situations where senior officers committed crimes. Yes, sir. Commander Garrett states that Admiral Aldridge sexually assaulted her and she defended herself. She also states that the entire incident was recorded under some kind of JSOC authorization. Prescott's eyes shifted to Ashlyn with an expression that might have been recognition, except it was gone too quickly to be certain. Commander Garrett, I'm going to need you to come with me for a formal statement. Medical personnel will examine you for injuries. Everything from this point will be documented according to standard criminal investigation protocols. Understood, Agent Prescott. I have recording equipment that captured the complete audio of Admiral Aldridge's assault. I'm prepared to provide full testimony and all relevant evidence. This is absurd, Aldridge interjected from his position on the floor, his voice gaining strength as consciousness fully returned, and brought with it the comfortable delusion that his rank still mattered in a room full of people who just watched him get taken down by someone half his size. I demand that Commander Garrett be placed in custody immediately. She assaulted me. She came to this meeting armed with recording equipment, an obvious premeditation to Admiral Aldridge. Prescott's voice cut through the bluster with the flat authority of someone who'd interrupted flag officers before and would do it again. I'm advising you that anything you say from this point may be used as evidence in criminal proceedings. You have the right to legal counsel. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly recommend you exercise both of those rights until Jag arrives. The expression on Aldridge's face suggested he was having difficulty processing the concept that a civilian investigator was treating him like a criminal rather than a victim, that his authority to give orders and expect obedience had somehow evaporated in the 10 seconds it took Commander Garrett to render him unconscious on his own briefing room floor. Prescott turned back to Sullivan with the wary patience of someone who'd learned that military personnel required explicit instructions during situations that violated their understanding of how the chain of command was supposed to work. Master Chief, I need you and Petty Officer Williams to secure this room as a crime scene. Nobody enters without my authorization. Nobody removes anything. The furniture stays exactly where it is. I want photographs of everything, including the position where Admiral Aldridge fell. Can you handle that? Yes, sir. Good. Medical team, I need Admiral Aldridge transported to the base hospital for evaluation, but he is not to be left alone at any time. One of my agents will accompany him and document any statements he makes. Commander Garrett, you're coming with me. Ashlyn followed Prescott out of conference room Delta 7 without looking back at Aldridge, without any visible reaction to the threats he was already making about lawyers and connections and political influence that would destroy her career. Sullivan watched her go with the distinct impression that Commander Garrett had been through situations far more dangerous than angry admirals making empty promises about consequences that would never arrive. The NCIS field office, at Crimson Bay Naval Command Center occupied a secure wing of Building 7 that most personnel never had reason to visit and were generally happy to avoid. Investigating military crimes meant trafficking in the kinds of secrets that could destroy careers, end marriages, and occasionally result in people spending decades in federal prison contemplating the difference between what they thought they could get away with and what the evidence actually proved. Prescott led Ashlyn through corridors that seemed deliberately designed to be forgettable. Bland institutional architecture that made no impression and generated no memories beyond vague discomfort at being in a place where law enforcement officials asked uncomfortable questions. They entered an interview room that contained all the warmth and personality of a morgue, furnished with a metal table bolted to the floor and chairs designed to be uncomfortable enough to discourage extended visits. A woman was already waiting inside mid-40s with the kind of professional competence that suggested she'd been doing this job long enough to have seen everything twice. Dark hair pulled back in a style that prioritized function over fashion. Suit that was significantly better maintained than Prescott's, suggesting either more recent promotion or better personal organization. Commander Garrett, this is Special Agent Simone Aldrich. She'll be conducting your formal interview while I coordinate the broader investigation. Ashlyn noted the irony of an agent named Aldrich investigating an admiral named Aldrich, filed it away as the kind of detail that would make this case memorable to everyone involved, and settled into the uncomfortable chair with the patience of someone who'd been interrogated by professionals far less friendly than NCIS agents operating under American law. Commander Garrett, Aldrich began, her voice carrying the carefully neutral tone of someone who'd learned not to prejudge witnesses before hearing what they had to say. I need to inform you that this interview is being recorded. Everything you tell us will be documented and may be used as evidence in criminal proceedings. You have the right to legal counsel before answering any questions. Do you understand these rights? Yes, ma'am, and I decline legal counsel at this time. I'm prepared to provide a complete statement about Admiral Aldrich's sexual assault and my defensive response. Aldrich's eyebrow rose fractionally, the only indication that Ashlyn's directness was unusual for someone who just assaulted a flag officer regardless of the circumstances. Most people in her position would be demanding lawyers and preparing to negotiate complicated plea agreements that might keep them out of military prison. Alright, let's start from the beginning. When did you first receive orders to meet with Admiral Aldrich? For the next 8 hours, Ashlyn walked Special Agents Prescott and Aldrich through every detail of the operation that officially didn't exist and would never appear in her service record regardless of how it ended. She described the secure email summoning her to Delta 7. She explained the phone call with Captain Blackwell, who'd suspected Aldrich's predatory behavior for 15 years. She detailed the recording equipment authorized under JSOC special access programs that existed in classification tiers most flag officers would never know about. She recounted the professional discussion that gradually shifted into personal territory as Aldrich probed for weakness and vulnerability. The moment his hand found her shoulder with pressure that had nothing to do with military protocol. His escalating threats about career consequences if she didn't demonstrate proper respect and flexibility. The slap that came when she insisted he maintain professional boundaries. And finally, the recording itself. 47 minutes of audio that captured everything from Aldrich's initial predatory assessment to his final desperate threat. That recordings didn't matter if she was dead. Prescott listened to the entire file without interruption, his expression growing progressively more grim as Aldrich's voice filled the interview room with evidence so overwhelming that even the most expensive defense attorney would struggle to explain it away. Sexual harassment escalating to assault, abuse of authority, attempted rape, conspiracy to obstruct justice, and finally the threat of murder delivered with the casual confidence of someone who'd gotten away with similar conduct 23 times before. When the recording finished with the sounds of physical struggle and then silence, Aldrich was the first to speak. Commander Garrett, you need to know that you weren't the first person to report Admiral Aldridge's predatory behavior. Ashlyn nodded slowly, unsurprised, but needing confirmation of what she'd suspected when JSOC first approached her about this operation 6 weeks ago. How many victims came forward? 4 that we know about who filed formal complaints. 19 more who reported through unofficial channels or requested transfers without explaining why. All of them following the same pattern you just described. Isolated locations, disabled surveillance, threats of career destruction if they reported. And in every case, the complaints either disappeared or were handled through informal counseling that resulted in the victim being transferred while Aldridge remained in position. Which is why JSOC decided to take a different approach. Prescott's voice carried a note of satisfaction that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment for longer than 6 weeks. Commander Garrett, I need you to understand what's really happening here. This wasn't just about documenting one assault. This was about building a case against systematic institutional protection of sexual predators that goes far beyond Admiral Aldridge. Ashlyn felt something cold settle into her stomach as the full scope of the operation began revealing itself. She thought she was bait for one predator. She was beginning to realize she'd been bait for something much larger. Special Agent Vivian Hartley sends her regards, Prescott continued, and Ashlyn's head snapped up at the name. Commander Vivian Hartley had been one of Admiral Aldridge's victims 18 months ago, transferred out of his command after an incident in the same conference room where Ashlyn had just rendered him unconscious. Ashlyn had reviewed her file during preparation for this operation, read the clinical descriptions of harassment that escalated over months until Hartley faked a medical emergency to escape what she was convinced would become rape. Hartley is NCIS. Not exactly. She's Navy, but we recruited her after she transferred out of Aldridge's command. Asked her to help us build a case that would actually stick. For the past 18 months, she's been documenting his pattern, identifying other victims, gathering evidence that would support prosecution when we finally had enough to move forward. Prescott pulled out a tablet, swiping through files that showed the results of Hartley's investigation. Photographs of 23 female officers whose careers intersected with Aldridge's commands. Timeline analysis showing patterns of harassment, transfer requests, and career disruptions that followed Aldridge, from posting to posting like a trail of professional destruction. We've been investigating Admiral Aldridge for 14 months through official channels. Your operation today gave us the evidence we needed to make arrests that will actually survive legal challenges. But more importantly, it gave us leverage to pressure his network into cooperating with our broader investigation into how the system protected him for so long. Ashlyn processed this information with the clinical detachment she'd learned during operations, where mission parameters changed in real time and adapting was more important than understanding. She thought she was the protagonist in a straightforward story about stopping one predator. She was learning she'd been a supporting character in a much larger narrative about institutional corruption. How many people knew about this operation before today? At NCIS, 3 including me. At JSOC, maybe 5. Your handler using the Oracle call sign. A couple of senior officers who authorized the Special Access Program. Everyone else, including Admiral Aldridge's commanding officers, were kept completely in the dark until you transmitted that recording. Which means everyone above Aldridge in the chain of command is about to face very uncomfortable questions about what they knew and when they knew it. Aldridge's voice carried grim satisfaction. Because either they were complicit in protecting him, which makes them criminals, or they were incompetent and missed obvious warning signs, which makes them unfit for command. Either way, a lot of careers are about to end badly. Before Ashlyn could respond, Prescott's secure phone buzzed with the distinctive pattern that indicated priority traffic from NCIS headquarters. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting from satisfaction to something harder. We've got a problem. Admiral Aldridge's attorney just arrived, Randolph Thatcher, former JAG officer, very expensive, very connected. He's already filing motions to suppress your recording and demanding your immediate arrest for assault on a flag officer. Ashlyn had expected this. Predators like Aldridge didn't operate without insurance policies, and expensive lawyers were the best insurance that money and connections could buy. Thatcher would attack her credibility claim entrapments, suggest she'd seduced Aldridge, and then cried assault when he rejected her advances. Standard defense playbook for powerful men accused of sexual misconduct. Let him file whatever motions he wants. The recording speaks for itself. It does, Prescott agreed. But Thatcher is also very good at manipulating public perception and political pressure. Within 24 hours, conservative media will be running stories about a decorated admiral destroyed by false accusations. His supporters will demand your prosecution. Politicians who owe Aldridge favors will start making phone calls to people who can make this investigation disappear. Then we move fast, Aldridge said. Get the other victims on record before the pressure builds. Build the pattern case so overwhelming that even Thatcher can't explain it away. And most importantly, find out who else in the command structure knew about Aldridge's behavior and chose to protect him instead of stopping him. What they didn't know yet, what none of them would discover for another 6 hours, was that Admiral Aldridge's protection network extended far higher and reached far deeper than any of them had imagined. That a decorated war hero with connections reaching back decades was already mobilizing to protect his former protege, and that the fight for accountability was about to become significantly more dangerous than simply prosecuting one sexual predator. The investigation was expanding. The conspiracy was metastasizing. And somewhere in a hospital room where Admiral Thornton Aldridge was being evaluated for neurological damage, decisions were being made that would determine whether justice or institutional protection would win this particular battle. But for now, in this moment, Ashlyn Garrett sat across from NCIS agents who believed in accountability and felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. 6 weeks had passed since Commander Ashlyn Garrett rendered Admiral Thornton Aldridge unconscious in Conference Room Delta 7. 6 weeks of depositions, forensic analysis, witness coordination, and legal maneuvering that transformed raw evidence into the kind of prosecutorial framework that could survive challenges from the most expensive defense attorneys money could buy. The investigation had moved with unusual speed for a case involving a flag officer driven by evidence so overwhelming that even the Navy's institutional instinct for self-protection couldn't justify delay. NCIS had documented everything: Sullivan's 6 years of recordings, testimony from 23 victims, financial records proving systematic cover-ups, and 47 minutes of audio that made denial impossible. Now, on a cold January morning at Naval Station, Norfolk, the United States government was finally ready to hold Admiral Thornton Aldridge accountable for 12 years of predatory behavior that had destroyed careers, shattered lives, and corrupted the institutions designed to prevent exactly the kind of abuse he'd perfected. The military courtroom at Naval Station Norfolk possessed all the austere dignity that American justice could project when it dressed itself in uniform and demanded accountability from those who'd sworn oaths to defend the Constitution. High ceilings that made every voice echo with the weight of consequence. Mahogany paneling salvaged from a decommissioned battleship that had seen actual combat in the Pacific. Windows positioned to allow natural light without permitting views of the outside world, as if the proceedings within existed in a space separate from normal reality, where rank and politics and connections meant nothing compared to evidence and law. Captain Lydia Morrison stood at the prosecution table, reviewing notes that she'd already memorized, the ritual born from 22 years of trial experience that had taught her preparation was 90% of advocacy and the other 10% was controlled aggression delivered with surgical precision. At 48 years old, she'd earned the nickname The Hammer through a 94% conviction rate that included cases against officers whose connections reached into the Pentagon and occasionally the White House itself. She'd prosecuted corruption cases that exposed procurement fraud measured in millions, espionage cases that revealed American officers selling secrets to adversaries, murder cases where military personnel had killed their own comrades over grievances that couldn't survive the bright light of evidence and cross-examination. But the case against Admiral Thornton Aldrich carried a particular weight that had nothing to do with legal complexity and everything to do with the message it would send about whether the system could hold predators accountable when those predators wore stars and commanded the loyalty of powerful allies. Across the aisle, Randolph Thatcher arranged his own materials with the meticulous care of someone who charged $800 per hour and believed presentation mattered as much as substance. 62 years old, silver-haired, possessed of the kind of distinguished appearance that juries instinctively trusted until Morrison demolished his arguments with evidence that made trust irrelevant. He'd spent 15 years as a JAG officer before transitioning to civilian practice where defense work, paid significantly better than prosecution and moral ambiguity, was just another billable service. The gallery was packed with media representatives, military officers whose presence signaled either support for accountability or quiet calculation about which side would win, and victims who'd waited years for this moment. Commander Vivian Hartley sat in the front row wearing her dress uniform and an expression that suggested she'd waited 18 months for the opportunity to watch Thornton Aldrich face consequences that had eluded him for 12 years. Lieutenant Amelia Whitmore occupied the seat beside her younger and less certain but present because she decided that silence had protected predators long enough. Behind them sat 9 other women whose careers had intersected with Aldrich's command and emerged damaged in ways that fitness reports and promotion boards could never fully capture. The military panel filed in with the formal precisions that defined every aspect of military justice. 8 officers whose service records suggested competence and integrity, but whose ultimate judgment would depend on whether they believed Commander Ashlyn Garrett or the 3-star admiral who'd assaulted her in a locked room he thought was free from witnesses and consequences. 2 female O5s whose own experiences with harassment would remain unspoken, but whose eyes suggested they understood what was at stake. 1 female O4 who'd made her career in aviation, where competence was measured in flight hours and mission success rather than someone's assessment of whether she demonstrated proper deference to male authority. 3 male O6s whose decades of service had shown them enough darkness that they'd learned to recognize predators regardless of what uniform they wore. 2 male O5s whose careers in special operations had taught them that honor wasn't about rank. It was about what you did when nobody was watching, and you could get away with anything. Captain Raymond Caldwell entered last, taking his position as military judge, with the gravity of someone who understood that this trial would define whether the Navy meant what it said about zero tolerance for sexual assault, or whether those were just words printed in training materials that everyone ignored when the accused wore enough stars. Caldwell was 56 years old, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent 20 years as a SEAL before injuries forced him into legal practice, where his understanding of violence made him uniquely qualified to judge cases where military personnel claimed self-defense. He'd seen combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. He'd killed people who'd been trying to kill him. He understood the difference between excessive force and appropriate response in ways that most judges never would. This court is now in session, the United States versus Admiral Thornton Aldrich. The accused stands charged with sexual assault on a military officer, abuse of authority conduct, unbecoming an officer, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. How does the accused plead? Thatcher rose with practiced grace, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of someone who'd convinced juries that obvious guilt was actually reasonable doubt wearing a different suit. Not guilty to all charges, Your Honor. Admiral Aldrich maintains his innocence and looks forward to demonstrating that these accusations result from a calculated campaign to destroy a decorated officer's career through fabricated evidence and coordinated false testimony. Morrison remained seated, letting Thatcher's words hang in the air long enough for the panel to process the implicit insult that 12 women had coordinated false accusation against a man who'd spent 32 years in uniform, that Commander Garrett had engineered an elaborate setup involving JSOC authorization and real-time monitoring just to frame someone for assault, that 23 victims spanning 12 years represent a conspiracy rather than pattern. Judge Caldwell's expression suggested he'd heard similar defenses before and found them no more convincing now than he had then. Captain Morrison, you may proceed with opening statements. Morrison stood buttoning her uniform jacket with deliberate precision, then walked to the podium, positioned between the prosecution table and the panel. She didn't consult notes. She'd delivered versions of this speech enough times that the structure was embedded in her memory, though the details changed with each case and each victim who'd found the courage to demand accountability. Members of the panel, the evidence you will hear over the coming days will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Admiral Thornton Aldridge is a sexual predator who spent 12 years using his authority to prey on female officers under his command. You will hear testimony from 12 victims who experienced his systematic pattern of harassment, assault, and threats. You will hear evidence of 23 separate incidents spanning multiple commands and deployments. You will hear recordings of Admiral Aldridge committing sexual assault, threatening to kill Commander Ashlyn Garrett if she reported his conduct, and explicitly stating his belief that his rank exempted him from accountability. She paused, letting the weight of those accusations settle into the minds of 8 officers who would ultimately decide whether Aldridge spent his remaining years in federal prison or walked free with his pension intact and his reputation preserved through expensive legal maneuvering. The defense will ask you to believe that this decorated officer was entrapped by a conspiracy involving NCIS JSOC and a dozen female officers who coordinated false accusations. They will suggest that Commander Garrett, a decorated intelligence officer with 10 years of exemplary service, engineered an elaborate setup because she was angry about fitness report comments or assignment decisions. Morrison's voice hardened, shifting from exposition to argument with the precision of someone who knew exactly when to apply pressure. But the evidence will show something much simpler and much darker. Admiral Aldridge believed that his 3 stars made him untouchable. He believed that isolated locations and disabled surveillance systems would protect him. He believed that his victims would remain silent because reporting would destroy their careers while he remained protected by a network of officers who valued institutional reputation over individual justice. He was wrong. Commander Garrett stopped him. NCIS documented his crimes. And now, this panel has the opportunity to demonstrate that the United States Navy means what it says about accountability regardless of rank or connections, or how many years someone wore the uniform before they decided that authority meant permission to abuse those they were sworn to protect. She returned to her seat without theatrics, letting the substance of her words carry weight that performance could never match. Thatcher's opening statement followed the predictable trajectory of every defense attorney representing a powerful man accused of sexual misconduct. He emphasized Aldridge's 32 years of distinguished service. He questioned Commander Garrett's credibility by noting that her classified service record contained gaps suggesting activities that couldn't be verified or challenged. He described the recording as evidence of entrapment rather than assault, suggesting that Garrett had deliberately provoked Aldridge to create a confrontation she could document. He saved his strongest attack for the institutional conspiracy theory that would appeal to any panel member who'd spent enough time in the military to believe that headquarters loved destroying careers through political correctness and zero-defect mentality that made no room for human imperfection. Members of the panel, you will be asked to bend Admiral Aldridge's career based on a recording obtained through deception testimony from witnesses who coordinated their stories with NCIS agents and an interpretation of events that assumes the worst about a man who dedicated his adult life to serving this nation. I ask you to remember that in America, we prove guilt. We don't assume it. And reasonable doubt isn't just some technical loophole. It's the foundation of justice that protects all of us from accusations that substitute political agenda for evidence. Judge Caldwell waited until Thatcher finished his performance before addressing the panel with instructions that would govern how they evaluated everything that followed. Members of the panel, you will consider only the evidence presented during this trial. You will not be influenced by the accused's rank or service record, except as it relates directly to the charges. You will evaluate witness credibility based on their testimony under oath, not on assumptions about why they came forward or what motivated their cooperation with investigators. Your verdict must be based on evidence proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Nothing less, nothing more. This is about whether Admiral Aldrich committed the crimes charged, not about broader questions of military culture or institutional reform. The first witness called by the prosecution was Commander Vivian Hartley, who walked to the stand with the controlled dignity of someone who'd been waiting 18 months to tell this story under oath, where lies carried consequences and truth had protection that hadn't existed when she'd been alone in conference room Delta 7 with a predator who believed she had no options except submission or career destruction. Morrison began with the background questions designed to establish Hartley's credibility and counter the inevitable defense attacks on her motivation. 17 years of service, exemplary fitness reports, deployment to Afghanistan where she'd earned a Bronze Star for her role coordinating intelligence operations that disrupted insurgent networks. Assignment to Admiral Aldrich's staff as a tactical planning officer, a position that should have been the highlight of her career, and instead became the reason she'd seriously considered leaving the Navy entirely. Commander Hartley, can you describe your working relationship with Admiral Aldrich during the first 6 months of your assignment? Hartley's voice remained steady, clinical, the tone of someone who'd practiced this testimony enough times that emotion wouldn't derail her ability to deliver facts that spoke for themselves. Initially professional, ma'am, Admiral Aldrich sought my input on operational planning. He praised my analytical work. He recommended me for additional training opportunities that would have enhanced my career prospects. I believed I was fortunate to serve under an officer with his experience and connections. When did that relationship change? Approximately 7 months into my assignment, Admiral Aldrich began requesting meetings in Conference Room Delta 7 rather than his office, where his staff would normally be present. He started making comments about my appearance that had nothing to do with uniform regulations. He asked personal questions about my relationships and living situation that exceeded normal professional interest. Morrison walked Hartley through the escalation with the methodical precision of someone building a narrative that the panel couldn't dismiss as misunderstanding or coincidence. The gradual progression from inappropriate comments to unwanted touching. The moment Aldrich cornered her in Delta 7 and made explicit that her career advancement depended on her willingness to provide services that had nothing to do with tactical planning. The way he'd lock the door and disable surveillance before informing her that nobody would believe her accusations against a flag officer. What did you do when Admiral Aldrich locked the door? I faked a medical emergency, ma'am. Claimed I was experiencing heart palpitations and needed immediate attention. He had to call for medical assistance or risk questions about why he'd allowed a subordinate officer to suffer a cardiac event without intervention. The corpsmen arrived within minutes. I was transported to the base hospital. While there, I requested an emergency transfer, claiming family crisis that required my presence across the country. Did you report Admiral Aldrich's conduct through official channels? Hartley's expression flickered with something that might have been regret or anger or the particular frustration of someone who'd been forced to choose between justice and survival. No, ma'am. I calculated that reporting would result in investigation that pitted his word against mine with no witnesses and no evidence beyond my testimony. His connections and rank meant he would likely escape consequences while I would be branded as someone who made false accusations against the superior officer. My career would be destroyed regardless of whether anyone believed me, so I chose survival over accountability. Morrison let that admission sit for a moment, allowing the panel to process what it meant that a decorated officer had been forced to abandon justice because the system was designed to protect predators more effectively than victims. When did you first have contact with NCIS regarding Admiral Aldridge? 3 months after my transfer, Special Agent Duncan Prescott contacted me through secure channels and explained that NCIS had been receiving reports about Admiral Aldridge's conduct from multiple sources. He asked if I would be willing to cooperate with an investigation that might result in criminal prosecution. I agreed immediately. What form did that cooperation take? For 18 months, I helped NCIS identify other potential victims and document patterns in Admiral Aldridge's behavior. I reviewed his assignment history and cross-referenced it with unusual transfer requests from female officers under his command. I participated in preparation for the operation involving Commander Garrett, providing tactical advice about how Admiral Aldridge operated and what evidence would be necessary to prove his conduct. Thatcher's cross-examination attempted to paint Hartley as someone with a personal vendetta against Aldridge, someone who'd coordinated false accusations with other bitter officers who resented his demanding leadership style. But Hartley had spent 18 months preparing for these attacks, and every question Thatcher asked gave her opportunity to reinforce the pattern that no amount of legal maneuvering could explain away as coincidence or misunderstanding. Lieutenant Amelia Whitmore testified next, younger and less composed but determined to add her voice to the record, even though Thatcher would certainly attack her credibility by noting that she'd filed a harassment complaint that had been dismissed as unsubstantiated. Her testimony described being groped during a joint training exercise, filing a complaint through proper channels, watching that complaint disappear into administrative processes that somehow concluded she'd misinterpreted innocent contact in a crowded space. One by one, the victims testified, each adding detail to a pattern so consistent it might have been choreographed, except for the fact that these women had never met each other before NCIS brought them together to compare experiences that were separated by years and geography but unified by Admiral Aldridge's systematic predation. But the testimony that would ultimately determine the trial's outcome came on the third day when Master Chief Barrett Sullivan took the stand and destroyed whatever remained of the defense's strategy to portray this as conspiracy rather than pattern. Morrison established Sullivan's credibility quickly. 26 years in the Navy, most of it with SEAL teams conducting operations that remained classified decades after they ended. Bronze Star with Valor Device for actions in Iraq. Navy Cross for Afghanistan. The kind of service record that made questioning his integrity a fraught proposition for any defense attorney who understood that panel members would instinctively trust a fellow warrior over a civilian lawyer. Master Chief Sullivan, how long have you served as Admiral Aldridge's personal security officer? 6 years, ma'am, since he was promoted to Rear Admiral lower half and required permanent security detail. In that capacity, what were your duties? Protection of the Admiral from physical threats, coordination with base security, advance work for travel, ensuring his safety during public appearances and high-risk situations. Oh, did those duties ever include activities in Conference Room Delta 7? Sullivan's jaw tightened in the way that suggested this testimony was costing him something personal. Some belief about loyalty and the chain of command that had been central to his identity before. Evidence forced him to choose between protecting a predator and protecting the institution he'd served for 2 decades. Yes, ma'am. Admiral Aldridge frequently met with female officers in Delta 7. He would instruct me to ensure the corridor remained clear and prevent interruptions during these meetings. Did you find that unusual? Initially, no, ma'am. Flag officers often require private meetings for sensitive discussions, but over time I noticed patterns that concerned me. Morrison produced the USB drive that Sullivan had delivered to Prescott, the one containing 6 years of documentation that would prove Sullivan hadn't been a passive witness to criminal conduct. He'd been gathering evidence, because he understood the difference between loyalty to a person and loyalty to the principles that person was supposed to represent. Master Chief Sullivan, can you describe what's contained on this drive? Audio recordings from the anteroom outside Delta 7. Hidden camera footage showing Admiral Aldridge's behavior before and after meetings with female officers. Financial records documenting payments to civilian attorneys representing some of those officers. Witness statements I collected from other personnel who'd observed concerning behavior but were afraid to report through official channels. The courtroom went absolutely silent as Morrison played selections from Sullivan's archive. Audio of Aldridge instructing Sullivan to ensure he wasn't interrupted, regardless of circumstances. Video showing Aldridge checking his appearance before meetings, then emerging disheveled, while female officers left looking traumatized. Financial records proving that Aldridge had made payments to attorneys, representing women who requested transfers from his command payments that suggested settlements to prevent formal complaints. And finally, the recording that proved premeditation beyond any reasonable doubt. Aldridge's voice, captured by Sullivan's hidden device, speaking to someone on a secure phone line about how to handle the Whitmore situation by ensuring her complaint never reached investigators who might take it seriously. Thatcher's cross-examination attempted to portray Sullivan as a traitor who'd violated his duty to protect the Admiral. But Sullivan's response demolished that line of attack with the kind of moral clarity that couldn't be impeached by legal technicalities. Sir, my duty is to the United States Navy and the Constitution I swore to defend. Admiral Aldridge violated that oath every time he abused his authority to prey on officers under his command. I didn't betray him. He betrayed everything we're supposed to stand for. I just documented that betrayal so it couldn't be buried like all the previous complaints that people with more stars decided to ignore because protecting the institution meant protecting predators. The fifth day of trial brought the testimony everyone had been waiting for. Commander Ashlyn Garrett walked to the witness stand wearing her dress uniform with every ribbon positioned according to regulations and an expression that suggested she'd been through interrogations far more hostile than anything Thatcher could deliver in an American courtroom operating under rules of evidence and judicial oversight. Morrison began with background designed to establish that Ashlyn was neither a conspirator nor someone with obvious motive to fabricate accusations against a superior officer. 14 years of service, including deployments that remained classified, exemplary fitness reports, multiple commendations for actions that couldn't be described in open court because they occurred during operations that officially never happened. Commander Garrett, can you describe your assignment to Crimson Bay Naval Command Center? I was assigned to the Intelligence Division in March of last year. My primary duties involved analysis of overseas threat assessments and coordination with Joint Special Operations Command on counter-terrorism operations. When did you first have contact with Admiral Aldridge? He was the senior officer responsible for oversight of intelligence operations at Crimson Bay. I briefed him periodically on assessments relevant to his responsibilities. Prior to the incident on November 14th, our interactions were professional and limited to operational matters. Morrison walked Ashlyn through the morning of the assault with the same methodical precision she'd applied to every previous witness. The secure emails summoning her to Delta 7, the recording equipment authorized under JSOC special access programs. The conversation with Captain Blackwell, who'd warned her that Aldridge was dangerous in ways that extended beyond his predatory behavior toward female officers. Commander, when you entered conference room Delta 7 that morning, did you expect Admiral Aldridge to assault you? Yes, ma'am. NCIS had briefed me on his pattern of behavior. I was specifically selected for this operation because my background included training that would allow me to defend myself if he escalated to physical violence, and because my service record was strong enough that Thatcher couldn't credibly attack my professionalism or competence. The admission sent murmurs through the gallery. Ashlyn was acknowledging premeditation, confirming that she'd walked into that room, knowing what would likely happen. But Morrison had calculated that honesty about the operation's design would be more credible than pretending Ashlyn had been an innocent victim who happened to have recording equipment and JSOC authorization. Can you describe what occurred during your meeting with Admiral Aldridge? Ashlyn's testimony matched the recording in every material detail because she'd known that Thatcher would compare her words to the audio and exploit any discrepancy as evidence of dishonesty. She described the professional discussion that gradually shifted into personal territory. Aldridge's inappropriate questions about her relationships and career ambitions, his statement that advancement required flexibility that extended beyond military regulations, the unwanted touch, the threats about career consequences, and finally the slap that crossed from harassment into assault. What did you do when Admiral Aldridge struck you? I informed him that his conduct was being recorded and transmitted to JSOC monitors. I requested that he maintain professional distance and cease his assault. He responded by threatening to kill me if I reported his behavior, stating that no recording would matter if I was dead. What happened next? Admiral Aldridge attempted to strike me with a closed fist. I defended myself using non-lethal restraint techniques I learned during JSOC training. I intercepted his arm, applied palm strike to his jaw, and rendered him unconscious through carotid artery compression. Total time from his initial attack to loss of consciousness was approximately 8 seconds. Morrison produced the recording device from evidence, entering it formally into the trial record before playing the complete 47 minutes of audio that captured every threat Aldridge had made and every warning Ashlyn had provided before she'd been forced to defend herself physically. The panel listened in absolute silence as Aldridge's voice filled the courtroom with evidence that no amount of legal maneuvering could explain as anything except predatory behavior by someone who believed his rank exempted him from consequences. His threats about career destruction, his statement that female officers needed to understand their place in hierarchies where senior men held absolute authority, his casual mention that other women had learned these lessons before and Garrett would learn them too, and finally, the threat that sealed his conviction long before the panel formally deliberated. Aldridge's voice clear and unmistakable, stating that no recording would matter if she was dead, that accidents happened during confrontations, that his word as a 3-star admiral would always be believed over the evidence of someone who wouldn't survive to challenge his version of events. Thatcher's cross-examination attempted to portray the recording as edited or taken out of context, but technical analysis by NCIS forensic specialists had confirmed that the audio was continuous and unmanipulated. Every word Aldridge spoke had been captured with timestamp precision that made claims of selective editing impossible to sustain. Commander Garrett, isn't it true that you engineered this entire situation specifically to entrap Admiral Aldridge? I was assigned to document Admiral Aldridge's criminal conduct and defend myself if necessary. He chose to assault me. He chose to make threats. He chose to attempt murder when I refused to submit. Those were his choices, not mine. When you went into that room armed with recording equipment and JSOC authorization, you deliberately provoked him by questioning his tactical judgment. You wanted him to attack you so you could claim self-defense. Ashlyn's expression didn't change, but her voice carried an edge that suggested Thatcher had crossed into territory where his questions revealed more about his client's guilt than her alleged misconduct. Sir, I entered that room prepared to defend myself because NCIS had documented that Admiral Aldridge was a sexual predator who'd assaulted 23 women over 12 years. I recorded our conversation because I knew he would assault me, and I needed evidence that would survive legal challenges from expensive attorneys like you. And I defended myself when he attempted to kill me because I wasn't willing to die quietly just so the Navy could avoid the embarrassment of prosecuting a flag officer for rape and murder. The courtroom erupted before Judge Caldwell could restore order with his gavel, and a warning that another outburst would result in clearing the gallery. But the damage was done. Ashlyn had stated plainly what everyone in the room already understood. This trial wasn't really about whether Aldridge had assaulted her. The evidence made that undeniable. This trial was about whether the institution valued accountability more than preserving its reputation by protecting powerful predators who wore the uniform as camouflage for criminal behavior. The sixth day of trial brought the surprise that neither Morrison nor Thatcher had anticipated, though perhaps they should have. The prosecution called Admiral Garrison Wycliffe as a character witness for Admiral Aldrich, then proceeded to destroy him with evidence that the defense hadn't known existed. Wycliffe was 72 years old, with the kind of distinguished appearance that cameras loved and recruitment campaigns featured. Navy Cross from Desert Storm. 38 years of service ending with retirement as a full 4-star admiral whose opinion on military matters was regularly sought by politicians and media outlets looking for authoritative voices to validate whatever policy position they'd already decided to adopt. His testimony began exactly as expected. He praised Aldrich as one of the finest officers he'd ever mentored. He questioned whether NCIS had properly investigated alternative explanations for the pattern of female transfers from Aldrich's commands. He suggested that perhaps young officers today were too quick to interpret demanding leadership as harassment. Morrison let him talk, let him establish his credibility and his defense of Aldrich with enough rope that what came next would be inescapable. Admiral Wycliffe, you mentioned that you mentored Admiral Aldrich throughout his career. When did that mentorship begin? When he was a lieutenant commander serving on my staff in 1998, I recognized his potential immediately and made sure he received assignments that would prepare him for flag rank. And during that time, did you ever receive complaints about Lieutenant Commander Aldrich's conduct toward female personnel? Wycliffe hesitated the first crack in his confident facade, suggesting he understood where this was heading, but couldn't see any way to avoid the trap that Morrison had spent weeks preparing. I may have heard concerns that were handled through counseling. I don't recall specific details after 27 years. Morrison produced documents from NCIS archives complaints that had been filed in 1998 by 3 different female officers serving under Aldrich's supervision. Complaints that described harassment escalating to assault. Complaints that had been routed to Wycliffe as the senior officer responsible for addressing misconduct within his command. Admiral Wycliffe, do these complaints refresh your memory about specific concerns regarding then Lieutenant Commander Aldrich? I handled those matters appropriately through counseling and administrative action. The officers involved were satisfied with the resolution. Is that why all 3 requested transfers within weeks of filing their complaints? Is that why none of them were promoted on schedule? Is that why their careers effectively ended while Lieutenant Commander Aldrich received your enthusiastic endorsement for assignments that led to his eventual promotion to flag rank? Morrison produced financial records showing payments from accounts controlled by Wycliffe to attorneys representing women who'd accused officers under his command of sexual misconduct. She produced communications, proving that Wycliffe had coordinated with Admiral Aldrich to ensure that complaints never reached investigators who might take them seriously. She produced testimony from retired officers who described a protection network that extended throughout the senior leadership officers who valued institutional reputation over individual justice and believed that admitting the Navy had a sexual assault problem would damage recruitment and retention more than quietly burying complaints and transferring victims. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Garrison Wycliffe hadn't just failed to stop one predator. He'd protected multiple predators over decades, building a network that ensured complaints disappeared and careers ended for anyone who dared to challenge officers he'd decided were valuable to the institution. Judge Caldwell stopped the testimony and ordered Wycliffe to seek immediate legal counsel, but the damage was done. The panel had watched a decorated war hero revealed as someone who'd systematically protected sexual predators because acknowledging their crimes would reflect poorly on his judgment and leadership. Someone who'd valued his legacy more than the careers and lives of dozens of women who trusted that reporting would result in justice rather than retaliation. Thatcher requested a recess to confer with his client. When court resumed, 3 hours later, His expression suggested those conversations hadn't gone well. Aldrich took the stand against his attorney's advice, driven by ego and the delusion that he could somehow convince 8 officers that 47 minutes of recorded threats and assault were actually evidence of conspiracy rather than crime. Morrison's cross-examination was surgical. Every question designed to force Aldrich to either admit guilt or contradict evidence that couldn't be disputed. Every answer he provided either confirmed his predatory behavior or demonstrated consciousness of guilt through obviously false claims that the panel would recognize as lies. Admiral Aldrich, you stated in your direct examination that Commander Garrett provoked you by questioning your tactical judgment. Is that correct? Yes, she was insubordinate and disrespectful in ways that required correction. And that correction took the form of striking her across the face with your open palm. I was establishing necessary discipline for an officer who'd forgotten her place in the chain of command. Morrison let that answer hang in the air, long enough for the panel to process what Aldrich had just admitted, that he believed his authority included the right to strike subordinates who questioned his judgment. That discipline meant assault when officers demonstrated insufficient deference to his rank. Admiral, you also stated on the recording that no evidence would matter if Commander Garrett was dead. What did you mean by that? Aldrich's face flushed red as he realized Morrison was walking him through every threat he'd made, forcing him to either own them or claim the recording was fabricated despite technical evidence proving its authenticity. I was speaking hypothetically about the legal challenges that would result from any confrontation. You were threatening to murder Commander Garrett if she reported your assault. That's what you meant, isn't it? I meant that her accusations would be impossible to prove without corroborating evidence. Admiral, you struck Commander Garrett. You attempted to punch her when she informed you that your conduct was being recorded. Those aren't accusations. Those are facts captured on audio and witnessed by your own bodyguard when he entered the room. What part of your behavior do you believe represents proper conduct for a naval officer? Aldrich had no answer that wouldn't condemn him further. His expression cycled through rage and panic, and finally desperate calculation that perhaps the panel would value 32 years of service, more than 47 minutes of audio, proving he was exactly what 12 victims had testified he'd always been. The closing arguments lasted 2 hours. Morrison methodically walked through evidence that proved pattern, intent, and guilt beyond any standard of reasonable doubt. Thatcher made increasingly desperate appeals to institutional loyalty and the damage that convicting a flag officer would cause to military culture and command authority. The panel deliberated it for 3 hours, longer than Morrison expected, but not so long that she worried about acquittal. When they returned, the 4 women stood with an expression that suggested whatever deliberations had occurred hadn't been comfortable, but had ultimately reached consensus. Judge Caldwell addressed the panel with formal gravity. On the charge of sexual assault, how do you find? Guilty, Your Honor. On the charge of assault on a military officer, how do you find? Guilty. On the charge of abuse of authority, how do you find? Guilty. 5 more charges, 5 more guilty verdicts delivered in tones that suggested the panel understood they were ending not just Aldrich's career, but sending a message that accountability applied regardless of how many stars someone wore. The sentencing phase followed immediately. The panel recommended 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, dishonorable discharge and forfeiture of all military benefits, including the pension Aldrich had spent 32 years earning through service that had been corrupted by his systematic predation. Judge Caldwell concurred without modification. Admiral Thornton Aldrich, your actions have betrayed every oath you've taken and every principle this uniform is supposed to represent. You used your authority to prey on those you were sworn to protect. You threatened murder to silence a victim who refused to submit. You corrupted the institutions designed to ensure accountability, turning them into weapons against the officers who trusted that reporting would result in justice rather than career destruction. This court sentences you to 25 years imprisonment in a federal correctional facility. You will be dishonorably discharged from the United States Navy with forfeiture of all rank, honors, and benefits. You are remanded to custody immediately pending transfer to Bureau of Prisons. Aldrich collapsed as military police moved to take him into custody, not from physical injury, but from the sudden weight of understanding that the authority he'd wielded for 3 decades had evaporated in the time it took a panel foreman to pronounce 8 guilty verdicts that would define his legacy far more accurately than any fitness report or commendation ever had. The institutional reforms came swiftly in the aftermath of Aldrich's conviction. The Secretary of Defense held a press conference, acknowledging that the case had exposed systemic failures in how the military handled sexual assault complaints against the senior officers. New oversight mechanisms were implemented. Anonymous reporting systems were established that bypassed chain of command. Independent investigators were authorized to pursue cases without seeking approval from the same senior officers who'd been protecting predators for decades. Garrison Wycliffe was indicted separately on 47 counts of conspiracy to obstruct justice, each representing a complaint he'd buried or a victim he'd pressured into silence. His trial was scheduled for 6 months later, though legal analysts predicted he would accept a plea agreement rather than face the kind of public exposure that Aldrich's trial had generated. 12 other officers were under investigation for their roles in protecting sexual predators, including several who'd risen to flag rank themselves and now faced the prospect of spending their retirement years in federal prison rather than consulting for defense contractors or appearing on cable news to discuss military strategy. The victims began their own process of recovery and justice. Vivian Hartley was promoted to captain and accepted a command position that had eluded her during the years she'd spent investigating Aldrich. Emilia Whitmore became an instructor at the Naval Academy teaching ethics and leadership to midshipmen who would enter the fleet with clearer understanding that authority required accountability. The others received corrected fitness reports, promotion reconsiderations, and monetary compensation that couldn't undo the damage to their careers, but at least acknowledged that the institution had failed them in ways that required concrete restitution rather than empty apologies. Barrett Sullivan was promoted to senior chief and assigned to the training command, where his mission was teaching security personnel to recognize and report misconduct by the officers they were sworn to protect. His testimony at Aldrich's trial had earned him a Navy Commendation Medal for integrity under pressure, though Sullivan privately believed the medal should have gone to the women who'd found the courage to testify against a predator when doing so meant reliving trauma in front of cameras and hostile defense attorneys. Ashlyn Garrett received promotion to captain and transfer orders to Joint Special Operations Command. Her new assignment involved leading a task force investigating military corruption worldwide, targeting officers who abused their authority for personal gain or predatory behavior. The team included Vivian Hartley as NCIS Liaison Sullivan as training consultant and Duncan Prescott as investigative lead. On her final day at Crimson Bay Naval Command Center before transferring to JSOC headquarters, Ashlyn walked through the corridors where she'd prepared for an operation that had changed her understanding of what justice required. She thought stopping one predator was the mission. She'd learned that the real mission was transforming institutions that protected predators more effectively than they protected victims. Lieutenant Emilia Whitmore waited outside Building 7 wearing the silver oak leaves of a newly promoted lieutenant commander and an expression that suggested confidence the system would protect her in ways it hadn't protected previous generations of female officers. Commander Garrett, I wanted to thank you before you transferred. What you did, what you risked, it changed everything. Ashlyn shook her head slightly, unwilling to accept credit that belonged to women who'd come forward, despite knowing that reporting might destroy their careers and their faith in an institution they'd dedicated their lives to serving. I had backup lieutenant commander. I had JSOC authorization and recording equipment and federal agents monitoring every word. You and the others who testify had nothing except the courage to tell the truth, when doing so meant facing hostile cross-examination and death threats from people who valued Aldrich's career more than your safety. That's what changed everything. Whitmore smiled, accepting the correction with the grace of someone who understood that heroism wasn't about dramatic confrontations captured on recording devices. It was about ordinary people doing difficult things when silence would have been easier and safer and more likely to preserve their own careers. What you said during your testimony about not being willing to die quietly, that's what I'll remember. That's what I'll teach the midshipmen when they ask me about leadership and courage and what it means to serve with honor. They shook hands, passing responsibility from one generation to another in the way military tradition demanded, even when that tradition was being fundamentally transformed by officers who refused to accept that accountability was optional for people with sufficient rank and connections. Ashlyn walked to the helicopter pad where her transport waited the morning sun rising over the Atlantic in ways that suggested beginnings rather than endings. Her phone buzzed with a message from an encrypted number she recognized as Captain Desmond Blackwell. "Proud of you, Commander. You did what I couldn't in 2003, what the system wouldn't allow me to do because people with more stars decided protecting institutional reputation mattered more than protecting the officers they commanded. The work continues. There are 17 more cases like Aldrich, waiting for someone with your courage and capability. JSOC briefing packet attached. Welcome to the task force." Ashlyn opened the attachment, scanning through files that described patterns of corruption extending throughout military commands worldwide. Officers who abused their authority for financial gain or sexual predation. Commanders who protected subordinates engaged in criminal behavior because admitting misconduct would reflect poorly on their leadership. Networks that spanned decades and reached into the senior ranks of every service branch. The work continued. The fight for accountability never ended. But today, in this moment, justice had won a battle that would make the next battles slightly easier to fight. She boarded the helicopter and watched Crimson Bay Naval Command Center recede below her, the facility growing smaller until it became just another installation on a coastline that had witnessed centuries of military service and sacrifice. The rotors beat their steady rhythm against morning air while Ashlyn reviewed files that would define her next mission and the missions that would follow for as long as predators believed that their rank exempted them from consequences. Justice wasn't a destination. It was a fight commanders chose every day regardless of personal cost or career implications. And today, tomorrow, for however many years she wore this uniform, Ashlyn Garrett would keep choosing that fight because some battles were worth having even when the cost was high. Especially when the cost was high. The helicopter banked east toward JSOC headquarters, carrying someone who'd learned that real strength came not from the authority to give orders, but from the courage to hold accountable those who believed their authority placed them above the law. The sun continued rising. The work continued. And somewhere in a federal prison, Thornton Aldrich began learning that the 32 years he'd spent climbing to flag rank mattered far less than the 8 seconds it took someone he'd underestimated to teach him that predators eventually encounter prey who refuse to be victims. 3 months later, in a federal courtroom in Virginia, Garrison Wycliffe stood before a different judge and accepted a plea agreement that would send him to prison for 15 years. 47 counts of conspiracy to obstruct justice, each representing a complaint he'd buried a victim, he'd silenced a predator he'd protected because institutional reputation mattered more than individual lives. The plea deal spared the Navy the spectacle of another high-profile trial. But it couldn't spare Wycliffe the reality that his legacy would be measured not by his Navy Cross or his 4 stars, but by the decades he'd spent building a network that enabled sexual predators to operate with impunity. 12 other officers faced similar fates. Some accepted plea agreements. Others demanded trials where NCIS would present evidence that demolished their claims of ignorance or innocent mistakes. All of them learned what Aldrich and Wycliffe had learned, that accountability eventually came for everyone, regardless of rank or connections, or how long they'd managed to avoid consequences. The reforms continued spreading throughout the military. Anonymous reporting systems that bypassed chain of command, independent investigators with authority to pursue cases without seeking approval from the same officers who'd protected predators, mandatory training that emphasized concrete examples rather than abstract principles, using Aldridge's case as proof that the institution meant what it said about zero tolerance. It wasn't perfect. Systems designed by humans would always have flaws, and predators would always adapt to exploit those flaws. But it was better, measurably, documentably better, in ways that could be tracked through reduced complaints, increased reporting, and most importantly, the absence of officers like Aldridge, who'd operated for 12 years because the system valued silence over accountability. Aislinn Garrett's JSOC task force identified 17 cases similar to Aldridge within the first 6 months. Officers who'd used their authority for predatory behavior, financial corruption, or abuse of power that destroyed subordinates while advancing careers. Some were prosecuted. Others were quietly forced into retirement with letters in their files that would prevent them from inflicting further damage. A few chose resignation over the spectacle of public trials that would expose conduct they'd convinced themselves was acceptable. The work never ended. But the message was clear: the institution had changed. Predators could no longer count on protection from officers who valued reputation over justice. Victims could report with confidence that their complaints would be investigated rather than buried. And officers like Aislinn Garrett would continue hunting predators regardless of how many stars they wore or how many decades they'd spent perfecting their techniques. In her office, at JSOC headquarters, Aislinn kept 3 items on her desk: her commissioning photo from Annapolis, reminding her why she'd started this journey; the recording device from Delta 7, reminding her that evidence mattered more than rank; and a handwritten note from Vivian Hartley that said simply, "Thank you for finishing what I couldn't. Now go finish 17 more." Justice wasn't a destination. It was a mission that required constant vigilance, unwavering courage, and the absolute conviction that some fights were worth having even when the cost was high. Especially when the cost was high. And Commander Aislinn Garrett, Captain Aislinn Garrett, now would keep choosing that fight for as long as predators believed their authority placed them above accountability. Because that's what honor required. That's what the uniform demanded. That's what justice meant when it wore the same uniform as the people who'd betrayed everything it stood for. The sun set over JSOC headquarters. The work continued, and somewhere in 17 different locations, officers who thought themselves untouchable were about to learn the same lesson Thornton Aldridge had learned in 8 seconds on a marble floor. Accountability was coming. And this time it wouldn't be stopped by stars or connections or institutional protection that valued reputation over truth. This time justice would win,